There, World History. It is time to start our unit on modern Africa. First of all, we should say that Africa is a pretty large continent. We're going to focus mostly on sub-Saharan Africa for this particular unit. And I always like to start off with a little brainstorm fun. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Okay. I'm going to ask you to do some word association here. And when I say Africa, I want you to grab your row of people, okay? Huddle up and come up with a list. What comes to your mind when someone mentions Africa? It can be anything, okay? What do you think of when you hear the word Africa? Try to come up with a pretty good list here. I want you to get at least 10 things down on your piece of paper. So you're going to pause me, okay? We're going to pause and we're going to do that. And then we're going to come back and I'm going to walk you through it. So ready, set, go. Pause me. You paused me, right? Okay, good. It's time to come back and it's time for us to talk about it. Now, usually when we do this in class, we get some interesting things like this kind of stuff. I bet you have some of this on yours, don't you? We get like what we know of Africa tends to be Disney related. Sometimes it's sports. Sometimes it's that Waka Waka song or that one song about the rain down in Africa. That one. Yeah. Did anybody have it? There's somebody out there that usually has that one. But then it tends to be a lot of really bad stuff. Okay. It's like, hey, there's a lot of war. Yep. Hey, there's famine and poverty. Uh-huh. There's, bad living conditions, not enough food. Some of you might have written about the girls kidnapped by Boko Haram. Maybe you've heard of Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab or Ebola, or maybe you had the AIDS crisis. But it tends to be one extreme or the other, either Simba, Disney, or horrible things, and there's not a whole lot of middle ground. So that's what I want us to start off with. Let's just recognize that. Let's just recognize that we tend to get a pretty skewed view or a pretty Disneyfied view of what Africa is. And here's what I want us to start off with, okay? The reality, that's a ridiculous question I just asked you to say, hey, let's come to, what do you think of when you talk about Africa? Okay, first of all, we're talking about 50 different countries, over 50 different countries here, very diverse continent. Each one has their own story. So we don't want to downplay that, okay? The story of Ethiopia is unique and different than the story of South Africa, which is unique and different than the story of Tanzania. So it's a huge question I asked you that essentially has no answer. So that's what we want to start off by recognizing. So now, what have we in this class studied so far about Africa? Well, you remember this? Remember our game, which really wasn't a game. It was the Berlin Conference in 1884, where Europeans kind of came in and said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We don't see any borders. That's like not seeing a price tag. That means it must be free. So we're just going to take the things, right? And they divided it up and they each kind of colonized their region. And every single country you see on this map, with the exception of Ethiopia and also Liberia, was taken over by a European country. Now, Ethiopia managed to fight. They're an independent kingdom. They had, as you guys might remember, a pretty strong king, Menelik II, and they fought him off. Liberia is a different case. That one sort of has to do with our country, believe it or not, the United States, which you will learn a little bit more about next year. You might remember it from 8th grade. But every country you see up here, taken over. Now, okay, what were we thinking about? What were we thinking about? What were we not thinking about when you guys picked your countries? Well, remember, I sort of set it up like this for you. I set it up so that you want the stuff. You want the copper. You want the ivory. You want some good port cities to trade. What are you not thinking about? Well, the same thing that these guys were not thinking about, which is, hey, there's already millions of people who live here who kind of have their own religion and language, who kind of maybe don't want ours to come in and change theirs. That's what the Europeans weren't thinking of. Now, you guys know also that in some countries, there was a pretty fierce rebellion. We talked about Algeria already. And we also know there's some pretty horrible things. And we talked about King Leopold of Belgium and what he did in the Congo. So we know that there's different ways that Europeans were ruling over their colonies. Direct rule, they actually had Europeans on the ground. Indirect rule, they're putting in puppet states, okay? They're putting a leader in and they're telling that leader exactly what to say or do. Assimilation, is when you're going to try to make people that live here the same as you. So this is why anywhere that you see here, this dark green color, French is still spoken today. Okay. And anywhere that's pink, English is still spoken today. So that's a way that they would assimilate. And then apartheid is kind of a unique system to South Africa, which we briefly learned about before. We're going to get much more into today, or not today, but in this unit. All right. Now, here's the big question. If colonial Africans always wanted their independence and constantly fought for their rights, because we know that that's true, why didn't they achieve their independence until after 1945? We know there were some rebellions here, right? We learned about Sentawa, we learned about Nhanda, we learned about Samari Touré up here in French West Africa. It's not that they didn't want to be independent. They clearly did. What's keeping them from actually winning? Well, really, World War II, of course, is a game changer. All right. And the traditional superpowers of England and France in Europe are no longer going to be able to run the show here. They just can't. They've been through two world wars in 20 years. So that's why all of these countries you see here will get their independence after World War II. Now, for some, it's going to be an easier road than others. Okay. Some are going to have to fight really hard. And why would they have to fight harder? Well, it depends. Some are going to have more resources. And so the Europeans are going to want to hang on. They're going to say, no, 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 we need you. But I think here's the fact of the matter. I think, and I think this is still true. Most Americans know very little about the history or causes of the problems facing a lot of these African nations today. And most Americans only know the problems. I mean, we only tend to hear the bad stuff. We hear the Civil War. We hear the child soldiers, right? We hear the human trafficking. We hear apartheid. We hear Ebola. We hear famine. There is a lot of good happening in this continent. There's a lot of potential in this region of the world. There's a lot of developments. There's a lot of unbelievably inspiring stories of people rising above their situations and creating something new. So we have to remember that democracy isn't instantaneous, you guys. We got our independence in 1776. And as you might remember from last year in eighth grade, it wasn't easy for us those first few decades. Like, we almost lost to the British again in the War of 1812, right? Other countries wanted to invade us. We were dealing with internal crises. We had, troubles with Native Americans who were already here. That's something you want to recognize. So in most African countries on this map here, boop, boop, okay, they get their independence in the 1950s and 60s, and some even in the 70s. It hasn't been that long. It hasn't been that long. You look at the struggles we faced in the first few decades, they're going to be facing those struggles in these decades and even some now. Okay. And that's what we want to recognize, that it's really easy for us to be like, geez, continent of Africa, pull yourself together and have instant democracy. We have to remember that's not how democracy works. It's a slow process, and it's a process that can easily be threatened. You get the wrong person leading that country. You get a divisive war or something happening at home, a crisis like a famine or a drought, and it puts strains on things and it makes things really, really difficult. So that's what I want us to try to understand. Let's try to not judge a situation, and let's try to really get into the why did this happen, and what strides have been made, and what can we learn from this? What's the good and the bad? Okay, what's some of the takeaway? Now, that being said, we can't possibly study all the nations in Africa in 2 to 3 weeks. I mean, that's just crazy. That's crazy. There's over 50 countries. So what I've tried to do is pick a few case studies that I think are relatively typical, and some on the good and some on the bad. Okay, we definitely want to understand the bad, but we don't want to only look at the bad and say that's the end of the story. I think there's a real danger in just saying, wow, that place is just a hot mess and there's nothing we can do about it, and it's all famine and war, and let's just move on. Like, I think we need to say, okay, so what can be done, what is being done, and let's think about solutions. Where can we go from here? That's what we're going to try to do. So we're going to look at, how did these countries get their independence? We're going to see some, it was an easier road than others. For some of them, independence was the easy part. Putting the country together is really hard, because remember, these borders, guys, let me go back to this map. These borders were not drawn by the people who live there. They were drawn by outside countries, and often with a nice little ruler like that. You see, They're not thinking ahead. They're not thinking what's going on. Nigeria, we're going to use Nigeria as a case study. There are almost 300 different languages being spoken in Nigeria today. There are three major religions. It's almost like many countries in one, and it makes it really hard for them to feel any sense of identity together, And it also makes it very easy for people to make it fragmented. And that's why we're going to talk about what Boko Haram has been doing in Nigeria, how they're able to do that. All of this stuff relates to history. Okay. So that's what we're going to do. Here's the ones we're going to focus on the most. Nigeria, for sure. Fragile success to a fragmented present. We need to understand what's going on today in Nigeria. We need to talk about Boko Haram. We need to talk about the Chibok kidnapping of the girls. We're going to look at that. We're going to trace that to historical things. That's where we're going to start. We need to look at Somalia. Somalia is a failed state. Somalia is the worst case scenario. And we're going to talk about how a lot of it's related to famine, but also how it's just an absence of government and what has happened and how it has affected our country. We're going to be talking about the event that's kind of referred to as the Black Hawk Down incident. And maybe some of you guys have seen that movie. We're actually going to see the History Channel True Story of Black Hawk Down. We're going to talk about this, but this is about as bad as it gets. Okay. Rwanda. We're going to look at what happened in Rwanda in 1994 and the danger, what I call the danger of indifference, of just, looking the other way. And also that is 6 months after this event happened. So those things are far apart geographically, but definitely related. Sudan, we're going to talk about the current crisis facing the brand new South Sudan and kind of what's going on there. And then we're going to look at Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa, troubled pasts, but very promising futures. And South Africa, especially, I think it has some amazing stories of inspiration. We're going to talk about Nelson Mandela and the role that he played in bringing democracy to South Africa after brutal, brutal racial segregation under apartheid. So there is some good stuff happening here, guys. We're going to look at that. We're going to talk about that. Try as much as you can to forget your assumptions and take a fresh look and get to know this continent in a way that we haven't before. So for now, what we're going to do next is I'm going to give you a little map where you can say, "Hi, Africa. Nice to meet you. I'm going to introduce myself to you." And you're going to see how diverse it is by looking at the countries and filling that out. Okay, so don't forget, itty bitty countries still count. A lot of times people forget Djibouti. How could you forget Djibouti? That's my favorite one to say. So don't forget the itty bitties and the ones that are landlocked. And, they count too. And you only have to label the cities I ask you to. Okay. You do have to label all the countries. You can handle that. But you only have to label the cities that I ask you to. They're the cities that have to do with these countries right here that we're going to hear a lot about. So grab a book, grab some friends, introduce yourself to the continent. Let's get ready to look at it in a different way.